I think we're okay to start now. Miss Lane is joining us by cell phone. We have our IT person, Robbie Beller, our IT director, headed over to give her a hand with her technology. But in the meantime, let's call the meeting to order. And I'll ask for an approval of the consent agenda and the regular agenda.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I'd like to add something to the agenda, please.
Okay. Well, my only concern with that, Mr. Massey, is that, I think adding things at the last minute, in fact, I sent out an email by a resident who was concerned with that issue. I know you've been a proponent for the past several years about adding things to the agenda at the last minute, but I think it limits public input on any issue and doesn't allow the public to weigh in.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
this is my personal opinion.
Yes.
From a board perspective, what I want to add should always be on the agenda during this.
Okay.
It's just COVID-19.
Okay.
That should always be on the agenda from a board perspective.
Well, Mr. Limita is going to give us an update on that during his report, but
Well, that's why I'm saying it should always be on the agenda.
Okay.
We're missing out on a lot of things.
okay. We will make sure we put those specific words on the agenda, but typically Mr. Limita updates us on where we're at as a township with that. Mr. Guzak, you had your hand up?
Yes, we needed to add one item to the agenda. If you look at check number, I think Mr. Limita was going to set check number 90823, $12,000. That's the postage for a postage meter for Pitney Bowes. It's in as a check, but it's not on the agenda. We need just to verbalize that so we can know that the board's realized that 12,000 needs to be approved by the board.
Mr. Limita, anything on that?
What it is typically our postage meter, our prepaid postage meter, never would exceed $10,000 in my spending authority, but because of the election, and we had to mail out all of the applications and ballots, that it took $12,000 on the Pitney Bowes prepaid postage meter for this month. So that we had to approve it in advance. It is in your accounts payable for board approval tonight. Treasurer Guzak just wanted to make sure that there was mention of it, particularly in the minutes. That, we didn't approve something that exceeded my spending authority other than we had to. We didn't have a choice to
I'm staying in the other room so you can get the volume on.
election stuff out.
Okay. Mr. Atkins?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I know we're excited to get the meeting going, but I think we skipped the pledge.
Well, we're going to, but, okay, you're right. So with that, let's go ahead. We've already started on the approval of the agenda. Mr. Massey wanted to ask that we add something for an update on the COVID-19. And Mr. Mansour?
Yes, I'd like to, if we could, drop that motion on the City Works into the operational issues. I just have a question on the number of licenses.
Okay, we can do that.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody want to make a motion to accept the agenda as amended? Mr. Mansour?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Okay, supported by Clerk Lane. Ms. Lane, I'll go ahead and call the roll call since I can see everybody and you can't, but Mr. Mansour? Mr. Mansour?
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Thomas? Mr. Thomas?
Yeah.
Mr. Guzak?
Yes.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Mr. Atkins?
Yes.
Clerk Lane?
Yes.
Myself, yes. With that, Mr. Atkins, would you lead us in the pledge?
Sure. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation, under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Pardon me?
Okay, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and mute our lines so that I can get some citizen comment here if there is any. And let's see here. With that, I'm going to unmute the lines for the attendees. Would any of the attendees like to make a public comment? Would any of the attendees that are attending like to make public comment? If you'd like to make public comment, I'd ask that speak up now. Okay, not seeing that there's any public comment, I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to the board.
Thanks to Mr. Miller, Mr. Chair.
Okay, good, I'm glad you're on. Okay, so moving into, I don't believe we have anything under future positioning right now since we haven't been able to meet very much. With regard to operational items, since we moved the City Works down to an operational issue from the consent agenda, we might as well start out with that City Works annual subscription renewal for $24,535 paid to Azteca Systems Inc. and authorize Township Superintendent to execute all related contracts and documents. Mr. Limita, any thoughts on the number of licenses that allows for?
I'm going to defer that to Jeff Sears. He's on the line tonight.
Okay. Mr. Sears?
I am here. I was actually going to defer to Robbie Beller, but apparently he may not be available.
Robbie was heading back.
Okay. Well, we will, if that's acceptable, we'll move it to the end of the operational issues and get an answer from him, Mr. Mansour. Okay. Next item under operational issues, the board will consider a motion to approve the clerk, or approve the request of the clerk to purchase additional Verity Scan digital ballot scanner machines for a not to exceed amount of $16,635. This purchase also authorizes the purchase of the annual service and maintenance contract for 6 to 10 years, for years 6 through 10, for the amount of $8,460 for a total authorization of $25,095. Ms. Lane, I thought your explanation in the packet was very helpful, and I think helped us to understand a little bit more the reasons behind wanting those or needing those. Mr. Mansour had his hand up, so we'll go to Mr. Mansour first.
So I just wanted to make that motion.
Okay.
And also, so I make the motion to add the Verity Scan Digital not to exceed $16,635 in the maintenance contracts to go with that.
Okay.
The question that I had to go along with that, though, is do we need a budget amendment in order to authorize this?
Mr. Limita?
It's, I don't know if Clerk Lane, I mean, right now she would have the money for this within her budget, under her cost center, but we're going to need a budget amendment before the end of the year, obviously, because it was an unplanned expenditure.
Ms. Lane, you had your hand up?
Yes, to the board, since that memo went out, we have done our reimbursement for a report to the state and to the county for the presidential election and for the general election. And there's a total that we will be getting back reimbursed of $88,000 Now, my expenses will show that that money is spent. I anticipate, based on last year for the schools, we got the reimbursement in August, and I would hope the state would be quicker to respond, but we have $88,000 in reimbursement costs for those two elections. I had the state agree to pay $2,600 for one of them, and half of the cost for the 3 machines for the maintenance. So those are some of the items that I know I've already got committed. Go back into at least a line item in the general fund budget. for
Nicole, can you make
reimbursement.
sure you get the screen in the background?
I've already talked to the person second in charge at the state, explaining that my need to get the 3 machines and would like more than just payment for half of one of the machines. So they are pursuing additional funding, and I will keep pushing them to get that so that it's not coming out of our budget.
I second the motion.
Okay, we've got a motion, it's been seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, Ms. Lane, you want to call the vote?
Certainly. Mr. Mansour?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas? Mr. Thomas?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Guzak?
Yes.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Myself, yes. Mr. Chair?
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Atkins, I'm sorry.
Mr. Atkins?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. The next item on the operational issues, the board will consider a motion to
Mr.
accept.
Chair,
Yes,
Mr. Chair, may I ask a question to Clerk Lane, please?
sure, sure, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to know, will we have the apparatus on hand by the next election?
I will be ordering it tomorrow,
I
and
didn't click on
that's
stream,
what I'm
live
explaining to
stream.
them. I want it in June so we can have it up and running, ready for August.
Can you do it
Because I
still?
still don't have a decision
here?
from the Secretary of State if it's going to be all AV or at the polls.
Thank you much.
Yeah,
Clerk
I know.
Lane.
You're welcome.
I'm gonna skip it because I don't have all that info. Okay, next item on the agenda is the board will consider a motion to accept the Fire Commission final audit and asset distribution recommendation by Yo and Yo.
I so move.
Support.
Motion and support. Mr. Laddie?
Well, you've got the final audit from Yo and Yo. It's been a long time coming, but I think been worth the wait. It took into account not only the end of the year as far as, or the end of the existence of the Fire Commission, as far as November 30th of 2019, and then you'll note that I communicated with you that there was some truing up of actual assets that were in
It is
various
streaming.
bank accounts. And also, interestingly enough, we
I
had
bet streaming.
$2,200 that needed to the state of Michigan through checks that weren't cashed or negotiated. And then we had the audit fees from Yo and Yo. So I know we're all glad it's finally here. And unless there's any questions from a legal standpoint on the audit, I can't answer any auditing questions, but I'll be happy to try to convey any information that's required.
Mr. Mansour?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Mansour's had his hand up for a little bit and then we'll go around.
Thank you. Attorney Laddie, please, we had an original, I think, audit included in the packet, and then there was a adjustment to it made within the last 24 hours or so. What was the crux of the change? Because I didn't see much of a difference.
There is the only thing, well, the two things that you got relatively recent, I apologize, was the actual audit itself from Yo and Yo. That came in late on Friday, and that document did not change from our when we reviewed. And it just really had, Walt and I had to sign disclaimer letters to make sure that there weren't any irregularities during the audit process. That's the only difference.
Thank you.
Okay. Who else had their hand up? Mr. Massey?
Yes, I have a question, Mr. Chair. Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
I have a question for the attorney.
Go ahead.
Attorney Laddie, why those checks were not cashed?
That's an interesting question. Some of them were older. That comes to mind, and this is the one that caught my attention. Was our old fire chief had a check for something like $250 that he didn't cash. This was Chief Cervetter. Other checks included payments for some other account that I think the auditors explained may have been credited in some other way. And so it's an odd accumulation of again, checks that hadn't been cashed, and the proper procedure, according to the accountants, is to send it to the state of Michigan where it can be claimed by those people and they can be put on notice. So I can get that information to you, Trustee Massey. I don't have it right now, but I'm happy to forward it on to you if you want to see it.
Attorney Laddie, thanks for that bits and pieces. But my concern is, if that was an audit done yearly, why the audit did not catch that? That's my main concern.
Well, that's a good question, and I don't, from an accounting standpoint, I don't know. I'm happy to ask Yo and Yo why this would be included in the final accounting and not noted annually. I can't really say. I didn't see their annual audit, so I'm not sure that it wasn't noted somewhere. But I'll ask Yo and Yo and see what they tell us.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Lane?
My question to you, Mr. Bennett, or Mr. Ladd, now that the fire commission as we had it is dissolved, if I'm understanding it correctly, are we going to continue having the people who were out servers on that commission work with our new fire commission, our new fire department in some way, or are we totally dissolving and not starting a new citizens representation on a fire commission?
We are totally resolving the joint fire commission between the city and the township. And any other committee that gets formed from this point forward would be, unless it's formed by the township board, would just be advisory from the fire department or at some level at the township. So there is no need or current framework for any advisory commission or any representation other than the township board directly operating the township fire department.
I would like to recognize the members that served on the committee in the future when we're able to meet face to face and make sure we recognize their service, because they put in many hours and for several years for the good of the township. So I want to make sure that when we get back together, face to face meeting, we do recognize our township representatives on that commission. Mr. Massey, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Laddie.
Okay.
How many more weeks, Attorney Laddie, before we will be out of this mess completely, 100%?
Well, so this is the first step of three things tonight. We're going to accept the final audit from Yo and Yo. The next step is you're going to adopt a resolution about the distribution of the assets of the fire commission, and then we've got a process for Chief Burdett to close out all the accounts but one, and write two checks out of that account, one to the city and one to the township. As soon as those checks clear, we'll close out all of the accounts. Chairman Barnes has the authority to transfer the vehicles from the name of the fire commission into the township. And then after the assets have been transferred and the bank accounts closed, the fire commission will be officially dissolved at that point in time. I want to say I think the city's going to meet sometime next week, or perhaps the following week. They have had the audit and the asset distribution information. I expect them to act on it without any problem. The next day is when Chief Burdett will go and close all the accounts but one and transfer the assets into that. So I want to give this at least 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks before we're officially done and all the accounts are closed.
Okay. Very good. So we had a motion that was seconded, and we've had discussion. Ms. Lane, would you like to call for the vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Massey,
Yes.
Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Thomas,
Yeah.
Mr. Atkins,
Yes.
Mr. Guzak,
Yes.
myself, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so item C is the board will consider a resolution for the distribution of fire commission assets and transfer of vehicles to the township.
Mr. Chair.
Second.
Okay, motion by Ms. Lane, seconded by Mr. Massey. Mr. Laddie, would you like to comment on this for the public and for the board?
Sure, just briefly, and I explained really the mechanics of it just a second ago. This is a resolution that's nearly identical to the resolution that the Fire Commission passed last week, and it identifies all the vehicles that are going to be transferred by Chairman Barnes, and it also identifies all the accounts, and there are 6 accounts with Fire Commission money in them that are going to be distributed to the township and the city. The city's going to get $432,965. That includes a payment from us of $319,738.98 for the vehicles and personal property. And then the township is going to get, of those assets, $593,558. Again, Chief Burnett's going to close the accounts out, write 2 checks. Barnes is going to sign the titles over, and then we'll be done.
Okay. Anybody have any questions with regard to the disposition of the assets or the vehicles and assets? Okay, there's been a motion, it's been seconded. Ms. Lane?
Mr. Atkins,
Yes.
Mr. Guzak,
Yes.
myself, yes. Mr. Thomas,
Yeah.
Mr. Massey,
Yes.
Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Bennett.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, item D, the board will consider a motion to accept the first reading of an ordinance repealing ordinance number 009, creating a joint fire commission.
I so move.
Support.
Support by Mr. motion by Mr. Massey, support by Mr. Mansour.
Thank you.
Mr. Laddie, any explanation that you'd like to provide?
Just, this is just to clear the Joint Fire Commission ordinance off our books. You recall this was a result of the discussions in 2008 that created the funding formula, recognized the existence of the Fire Commission. There is no need for that anymore, and so this is just to clear the decks of that ordinance.
Okay. So there's been a motion, it's been, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Lady.
This is the first reading of that ordinance. We'll need 2.
Okay. So there's been a motion, it's been supported. Ms. Lane?
Yes. Mr. Guzak,
Yes.
myself, yes. Mr. Massey,
Yes.
Mr. Atkins,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Bennett.
Yes. So I think that was unanimous. I don't know, one of them was breaking
Yes,
up,
sir.
I think. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. The item E, the board will consider a motion to authorize increasing the Parks and Recreation maintenance budget by $50,000 for 2020. Parks and Recreation Director Linehan requests the funds come from the Parks and Recreation millage funds to increase the annual maintenance activities at Bicentennial Park.
I'll make that motion.
Mr. Atkins has made the motion, supported by Mr. Mansour.
Mr. Thomas, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas? Okay. Okay,
I supported it all for the motion.
you supported the motion. What was that, Mr. Thomas? I'm sorry.
I second the motion and I call for the motion.
I'll call for the vote. Okay. All right, Ms. Lane, Mr. Thomas would like to call for the vote.
All right, Mr. Thomas,
It sounds like somebody's cell phone is going off here.
all right. Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Massey,
Yes.
Mr. Guzak,
Yes.
Mr. Atkins,
Yes.
myself, yes. Mr. Bennett,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. The item number F, the board will consider a motion to approve the 2020 through 2021 preliminary senior center budget for submission to the county. We're on their calendar year or their fiscal year as opposed to ours. Mr. Limata, would you like to speak to that?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Mr. Supervisor. Thank you. This is our first year working through this, as you guys all know, and for the public. So because the county senior services runs on their calendar year, starts on October 1st, they requested this budget come in for June 1st. Obviously, we would have liked a little bit more time to present to the board. I wasn't aware of that until just recently. It's also the first time for our senior coordinator, Misty, who is on the meeting and is happy to answer any questions, as well as Director Linehan is here to answer any questions. One of the concerns that came up when I first looked at this position, obviously, was we're used to seeing, obviously, as a public entity, you have to deliver a budget. When you look at the senior center budget versus their senior millage expenditures, what the board is really approving here is a submission to the county, which is a detailed breakdown of how we're going to spend the $170,000 that we get from the county senior millage allocation. But again, the first time through this for all of us, myself, Patrick, as well as Misty, she had a hand in obviously operating the senior center, but this was submitted by the Parks and Rec Commission directly.
Okay, so Mr. Linehan, are you on the line? Mr. Linehan? Yes, we can hear you.
So with this, one of the things that we were struggling with is the county, as far as the way that they want submittals go, they want to see like everybody's direct wages, which is what was giving us the not allowing us to balance it. So we're trying to work through that, and the way that it's submitted right now is just to show the county exactly what is being put in, and that they will not reimburse for 100% for administrative wages. We get that money through also CDGB funds. So that money comes from multiple sources, not just the
Jeff said he was going to defer it to you.
Office of Senior Services.
Okay. Anything more to add to it, or?
Well, I anticipate this just being one of the first steps in it. We're allowed through the county to do 4 adjustments throughout the year. So as we are getting into the process more, we can make some of those adjustments. Going through the budget documents from the past couple years, we were having some issues on just trying to figure out how it was done, and a lot of the things weren't making sense to us. So Misty last was talking with the county on a regular basis, trying to work some of this stuff out, and if they have any issues with what they see, they will kick it back to us, and we will make adjustments as needed for that.
Miss Lane? Wait, you're unmuted, Miss Lane.
If you're ready, Mr. Chair, I'm willing to make the motion that this first recommended budget for senior center is sent to the county.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, yes, Mr. Massey. We got a motion on the floor.
I kept raising my hand, Mr. Chair.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, my question is to the director. When did you receive notice of the budget? How long have you been aware of this budget?
Do you want me to answer that?
We received the email from the county Tuesday, May 19th, just after 2 p.m.
Okay. Mr. Mansour?
Wanted to ask the question. It looks to me as if this senior operations about $400,000 or so, and it looks like we get about 170 or so from the county, and so we fund the other 220, 230 ourselves. Is that a correct understanding?
Mr. Limita? I think Mr. Limita has an answer for that, Misty.
So if you look at the senior center budget, what we do get is we get a portion of the administrative salaries for Parks and Recreation. So the director, the administrative assistant, the maintenance supervisor, the assistant director, as well as senior coordinator, we get a percentage of their salaries. But when you look at the budget, the county is requiring Misty to provide the actual full salaries so they can see the percentage allocated. So that's what I said. The first time I got it, Trustee Mansour, it totally confused me. I just said, your budget's way out of whack. This doesn't make sense. Those need to be adjusted down. Certainly for the budget that we adopt for the senior center, it's going to be a balanced budget. But I guess this is what the county required, and so that it's not a full representation. Obviously, we don't charge the senior center for the full director, administrative assistant, maintenance supervisor, assistant director salary. But they required it to be shown. I to have somebody from the county explain what purposes behind that.
So we're getting revenue from a couple other sources. Through the community development block grant, we are getting money from that, and then from programs and rentals through the facility. So those are the three main ways that the senior center is being funded.
So the net of all of that for us is about how much? Do we know?
Probably just over 200,000 for just the senior center expenses. The senior millage of that 172.55, that covers about 95% of our budget, and then the rest is made up with revenue from other sources.
Thank you.
Trustee Mansour, when I ran it back through and adjusted those salaries back to the portion that we get to allocate to the senior center, I think it came in around $230,000 total revenue and expenses.
Thank you.
Mr. Massey?
Yes. Let me ask the question. I'd like for this to be verified. When you say county, you're really talking about the senior millage, right?
The Genesee County Office of Senior Services, which is what distributes the funding and the policies that we're bound by.
But did you understand the question I asked?
So the funding that comes from the county is via the millage, the senior millage, basically.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Well, the reason I asked the question, I didn't want no one online to think that the county is really giving us something. The county is not giving us anything.
Right.
Well, truth be told, the millage that comes from Grand Blanc Township for the senior center, I don't think we're getting anywhere close to the total that's collected, probably. But
that's right.
If that's what you're asking, Mr. Massey, so I just want to clarify: we are not getting the entire millage that's collected from Grand Blanc Township for our senior center. So, but it is a portion of it. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we had a motion. It hasn't been seconded with regard to this.
I'll second it.
Okay, Mr. Mansour seconded it. I think we're ready for the vote. Ms. Lane?
All right. Mr. Mansour?
Yes.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas?
Mr. Thomas?
Yes, if you get me on mute.
Okay.
Adkins?
Yes.
Myself, yes. Mr. Gusak?
Yes.
Mr. Bennett?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm picking up some feedback, so I'm trying to figure out whose line I need to mute to get rid of some of it. So, Anyways, item G, the board will consider a motion to accept as a first reading of an ordinance to repeal Article 4, Sections 14.80 through 14.92 of the Tree Protection Ordinance. We had a special informational work session this past week that we had Mr. Lloyd participate in and help us run, along with Mr. Limata, Mr. Laddie. And we discussed, I guess Mr. Limata wasn't named, but Attorney Laddie, and we discussed this at length. And I know that the board members that attended that work session felt that what was needed in the ordinance is covered in our other general ordinances. So I think everybody was in favor of moving this to this agenda this evening. Mr. Lloyd, do you have anything to add, or Mr. Limata?
Well, I do want to thank the board and the attendees at last week's meeting. I thought we had an opportunity to do a good job of bringing things out. There was a number of things brought up and addressed that I think were very worthwhile. And we walked through the ordinance, literally. But the things we discussed, just as a quick overview, is the cumbersomeness of it, the procedural challenges, administrative issues associated with it, big concerns about the constitutionality of the ordinance, of course. And then keeping in mind that, the township has a very robust development review process and an excellent landscape ordinance that does a terrific job of keeping and maintaining landscaping throughout the community, as well as a woodland ordinance that does a very good job. And it's relatively close as far as the volume of trees required to be kept as this rather cumbersome tree protection ordinance. We've got a number of projects you could take a look at just to give you an idea. If you look at the Heritage Project or Essentia, Magna, MGA, if you look at those, all those projects are truly beautiful developments. And so, point being, we can and we do a very good job of bringing in, high quality landscaping and development. And as far as the ability to save our trees with our current ordinances, as I said, the existing ordinance in the zoning ordinance does a very good job, as well as our review processes. So I think we've got that covered, and it'll take away some of the contentiousness that we experience when we're dealing with some of the larger developers. And frankly, under the circumstances, I think that, from my time here, we've looked at ourselves as partners with the development community, and I think that, we've go a long ways to helping with that.
Okay. Mr. Massey?
Mr. Chair, I have to make this negative comment. The previous board did a very poor job spending all of the money on this, what I call ineffective ordinance, as Mr. Lloyd has explained. And nobody's saying a word. It's though that, okay, it's acceptable for the board to make those kind of blunders. Just spend money and then come back and spend more money trying to undo what the previous board has incorrectly done. Sad
Right.
situation.
Yeah. Well, we try to avoid those, that's for certain. I know this dates back. Mr. Limata, what was the timeline how many years ago was this initiated? I can't recall.
In 2004 and adopted in 2005.
Okay. So close to 15 years, but you make a valid point, Mr. Massey, in that we will try to avoid making similar mistakes.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I went back to 2004, as you guys said, right?
That's when our contracted planner actually proposed this.
Yeah, 2004.
Right.
Then you came up with another ordinance in 2016.
Correct.
With the previous board. So I don't know how you could have gotten that deep into the mess that we're in right now. It seems like this board is always trying to fix the mess of previous board.
Well, thank God we're fixing a few, right? Okay, Mr. Mansour, you had your hand up, and then Mr. Guzak.
I'm okay.
Okay, Mr. Guzak?
Yes, this last one was done in 2016, and it was done by our consultant. We did not have our own planner, and they advised us to do it, and many other people use the same planners to do it. And it's unfortunate that it became unconstitutional, but that's not why we are taking it out of existence.
Yeah. Mr. Atkins?
I think this ordinance is really going to help a lot of property, a lot of development, especially down off Baldwin and Tech Village. I think this will be a good opportunity. I'd like to see a full update at our next meeting. Haven't really heard anything about the wonderful stuff going on in Tech Village for 14, 15 months. So.
Yeah. We can probably give you an update tonight on some of it, a thumbnail sketch of what's going on, but...
well, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
You know, we had a press conference about 14 months ago. So.
Right. Okay, so Ms. Lane, do you have your hand up?
I want to make a motion to approve the first reading that will repeal the general ordinance tree protection.
Okay, so Ms. Lane, you're making the motion. Is there support?
Support.
Who is that? I couldn't hear you.
Support.
Okay, Mr. Guzak. Mr. Laddie?
Just one point to make from an administrative standpoint. I want to make sure that the ordinance, it repeals, according to our agenda, it repeals sections 1480 through 1492. That also known, you can find in our Muni Code sections, that's sections 2300 to 2315. And then also, there was an amendment of the ordinance that is numbered, well, that amends all of those sections, but it was adopted in 2016. I want to make sure that our ordinance includes that as well. And that again is 2300 to 2315. And I'll make sure that the clerk's office has those corresponding codes to make sure we've got all of this off the books.
Okay. So there's been a motion and support. Any further discussion? Mr. Mansour?
Yes, thank you. I think what I would actually propose here is that this is the first reading of this, but by the time we get to the second reading, that we include all of those caveats and those amendments, et cetera, that Attorney Laddie mentioned, so that they're clear in what we're doing here. And also to mention that during the session that we held last week that the public was invited to, where we went into the deep dive here, we are taking a look just to make sure that we've done the best of both worlds in terms of the tree protection ordinance that we have on the books and the one that's covered in the zoning ordinance. So,
correct. Thank you, Mr. Mansour.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is the first reading, so we can include those things. Okay. All right, so there's a motion and support. Are we ready to ask for the vote?
Yes,
it appears. Go ahead, Ms. Lane.
Mr. Mansour?
Yes.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas?
Yeah.
Mr. Atkins?
Yes.
Mr. Guzak?
Yes.
Myself, yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Item H, the board will consider a motion to accept the second reading and adoption of an ordinance defining, regulating, and licensing charitable or civic organizations soliciting within public roadways and providing for penalties for violations thereof. I believe we have Chief Wiles on the line. If there's any questions, I know we answered some of them at our previous meeting. Mr. Laddie, any further developments on this ordinance?
No, just that the ordinance in front of you tonight has the amendment that we discussed on May 12th, and that is to eliminate the responsibility of the 501c3 verification from the township supervisor to just the township. And so it's an administrative process that does not fall on one officer. And as I recall, that's the only change that we have our first reading until tonight.
Okay. Chief Wiles, any input on the ordinance?
No, I think we talked it over pretty well at the last meeting. Happy to answer any questions that may have come up since then, though.
Okay. Is somebody willing to make a motion with regard to... Okay, so Trustee Massey made the motion.
Second.
Supported by, is that Mr. Guzak?
Yes.
Okay, supported by Treasurer Guzak. Ms. Lane?
All right, Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Thomas,
Yeah.
Mr. Atkin,
Yes.
Mr. Guzak,
Yes.
Mr. Massey,
Yes.
myself, yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we had left on the agenda, just a moment, I got some feedback here. Okay. Okay, so we had an agenda item that we moved to the end, which was with regard to the board will consider a motion to approve the 2020 through 2021 CityWorks annual subscription renewal for $24,535 paid to Azteca Systems, Inc., and authorize the township superintendent to execute all related contracts and documents. Mr. Mansour had a question on the number of licenses, and I know Mr. Sears, I believe, is on the line, as well as Mr. Beller. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Mr. Beller? Mr. Beller?
Yeah, hang on.
I don't think Mr. Beller was ready for my calling on him yet.
I can try to answer Al's question, Scott.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Sears.
I'm not sure what Al's question is quite yet.
It was, his question was, how many licenses does the subscription include?
It's 18 licenses.
My question was actually, do we actually, have we gone through and we are sure that we need all 18 of those? They're only $1,300 or $1,600 a piece, but still.
Yeah, because we can't share, in other programs we can share licenses, but in this program we have to have unique licenses to our names because we have inboxes for work orders, and everybody who uses them here are accounted for, and they all have their individual inboxes for their assignments.
Okay, and we don't anticipate a change in the staffing level, right?
No, not this year, not that I'll need another license for.
Those licenses are also for the internal staff as well. We need one for the clerk's department as well as the external staff, as well as myself and Matt Kimmer, who handles a lot of the maintenance and everything of the actual application.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so is there a motion to proceed?
So move.
Mr. Massey has made the motion,
Support, Mr. Chair.
support by Clerk Lane. Any further discussion? Ms. Lane, would you like to ask for the vote?
Mr. Guzak,
Yes.
Mr. Thomas,
Yeah.
Mr. Massey,
Yes.
Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Atkins,
Yes.
myself, yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Limita, can you give us an update on the COVID-19 and how our township is handling that? And also, if you can touch on the development with Tech Village and where we're at. We did have I don't know that we had a press conference, but we did have one of the owners on the news talking about a potential sale, and if we know anything about that private sale of the property yet. We have been asked numerous times who the developer was that was interested in purchasing it. They've asked to remain anonymous, and I don't think that's changed either. So we do have the DDA that's been functioning in that area, and we probably can even, the DDA hasn't met since we've been in the quarantine either. So, Mr. Limita?
If it's okay, I'll start with the Tech Village update. I don't really have anything to update on. They were in a due diligence period. I know that the last time I spoke with the owners of the property, that it was the week that we went into the state of emergency and then the statewide stay-at-home executive orders came out. That was the week that the developers had to make a decision on whether to pay some money and extend their due diligence period for an additional period of time, 90 days or 180 days. That was the last time. Obviously, we haven't met as a DDA, and I've gotten no information through the planning department that they have submitted any plans. So that's really the only update that I have for the Tech Village area. There are a couple of other updates of good news that we're working on currently for that Baldwin Road corridor. We've been approached. Metropolitan Planning and the Genesee County Road Commission have found an opportunity through economic development. It's directly related to development that was harmed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have the ability to get some funding that could be worth up to $3 million to allow us to do something with taking that Baldwin Road corridor. And primarily, this would be focused on South Holly west to the Dordt Highway extension. If we can show that there was some impact from COVID-19, that's the pace or the progress of where we were moving in development, we have the opportunity for some money there, up to 80%, and then the 20% match, but that could work out between the DDA has stated an interest in paying for the engineering, and then something to do with the road commission as well. So we're meeting on that Thursday morning at 11 o'clock. More to report after that, depending on where it goes. We believe that the MEDC may also be able to assist us with that federal grant and to be able to secure some money that will help us with the overall development of that entire DDA section in the southern end of the township. But as far as specifics are with Tech Village, I don't have the answer to that. It's been radio silent, so I don't know if they were working pretty hot and heavy leading up to that week. So I don't know if they went on their back burner due to COVID-19, but we've received no information in the township at all between the private developers and the private landowners. COVID-19 update, obviously, it's kind of hard to put your plans together when we're not sure. We're waiting on the governor to make her announcement on when the stay-at-home order might be lifted for us. She came back last week and extended it through June 12th. We were already putting our plans together on bringing people back in, obviously, for the 1st. That's going to get pushed back out through at least the 12th. We do have everything, all of our plans are in place. We're prepared to roll out. The township offices have all of the PPE. We've got hand sanitizer stations. We've got all the appropriate notices posted on the door. We've secured the temperature and the thermometers, the no-touch thermometers, so folks can self-monitor. We have protocols in place. We've followed everything from the CDC, as well as the state and county health departments and health and human services. So we're ready to go, and we're ready to bring folks back. Still have the folks laid off, except for one employee came back today. That is your assessor of record, Mike Dowler, returned to the office today. There's paperwork that's due by the end of the month to the state. So we brought him back earlier and spoke with Director Salvati and Assessor Dowler today. The two of them will be working on a return plan for the remaining members of the assessing department. They both expressed frustration with zero direction coming from the state on what they expect from us. As you guys know, we're required to actually boots on the ground walk 20% of the taxable properties in the township each and every year. Clearly, we've been set considerably and not sure what that looks like. Hopefully, the state's response to our inquiries continues to be back that most of their people are on furlough or laid off. So responses are a long ways coming. I think they're in the same boat kind of we are. We're not quite sure what it looks like. Clearly, we're not getting 20% of the properties inspected this year, but depending on when we get back, we'll ramp up the best that we can. And last but certainly not least, we're still operating on the assumption of somewhere between $1.5 and $1.8 million that we'll have to make adjustments to our revenue for 2020 and going into 2021. That's what we're being told by Government Affairs and the MTA as well as the MML. And we'll continue to operate on that assumption until we're told differently. We do have a plan in place. It will be interesting what this means for us because, again, our loss of revenue equates to a loss of service that we can provide. Got some employees on layoff right now, which certainly helps us preserve some money, but we're certainly, it's not $1.5 million worth by any means, depending on how long we're out. We'll continue to operate and be prepared to make those cuts. We've also looked at any all hiring freezes. The only person that we had prepared to go was the one we'd already made the offer to in the police department. And that officer is currently going through that onboarding process and being vetted. She did successfully complete her law enforcement training, and she's done with school, and that offer was accepted before the COVID-19 crisis went through. I also am working with Parks and Rec Director Patrick Linehan. He's having a hard time keeping up because we haven't brought back any of the seasonal people yet, just to keep up with the lawn mowing. As you guys are aware, they generate 75% of their own revenue through programs. With no programs running, it's a huge loss in revenue. It couldn't happen at a worse time for us with the COVID-19 and the anticipated loss of constitutional revenue sharing and statutory revenue sharing that we already knew we were going to have to amend some funds into Parks and Rec moving forward, and the longer that we can hold off on filling the seasonal staff, but there's going to come a point where we can't keep up even with mowing the fields. Luckily, we're not having to set up ball fields right now, which certainly helps us as far as managing labor, but I know it's coming, and it's just going to be a challenge for 2020. For those of you, the officers and I did sit through the preliminary audit last week with Plant Moran and talked about where our fund balance was after 2019. Typically, we look to take it back to the 15% mandated in reserve for the general fund. I'm happy to say that, like the last 3 years, we have about $1.4 million. That's the money that we have been putting on OPEB, again, which brought us up to the 49% funded. But that may be money that instead of being able to put it on OPEB this year, may be required for us to even to continue to operate at the service levels that we're currently at.
Thank you, Mr. Limita. Mr. Massey?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Based on what I heard the superintendent say, I sort of disagree with something he said. We won't know whether there's a shortfall until September. Okay.
I'm not sure about that, Mr. Limita.
I know about that.
Okay.
Let me
go ahead.
Let me specifically state something. So, as the record.
Okay.
Okay. Everybody knows that in Washington D.C., they're saying they're going to pass the next stimulus package for COVID-19 for the states and the schools. Not the one the bill that they just recently sent to the Senate. They're working on another bill just for the states and the schools. Now, that's going to change whatever assumption that's being out there that's misleading people that we're going to be in a financial bind. I really think this bill is going to come through in the next package, and I think it's going to help the schools and the states. I would bet on that. Okay, so I don't want the superintendent to put out misleading information that the township is going to be in dire heart of financial support. I don't believe that right now. I will know more about it until September.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Massey. It actually, the information that Mr. Lehman is sharing, I believe, is information that actually, Mr. Lehman, I'll let you explain where you've heard it from in terms
The
of.
Department of Treasury, the Michigan Municipal League, and the Michigan Townships Association continue to tell us that our constitutional revenue sharing will be cut by 50%. Now, if federal legislation comes through, backfill state coffers, and they choose to backfill and make local governments whole, that would be fantastic. But what I'm reporting is what I'm being told by the state Treasury Department, as well as, like I said, the other organizations.
Mr. Mansour?
You're right. I think that it's a little hard to tell with everything going on what the crystal ball is going to end up with. But I think it is prudent for us to have a couple of plans in place so that as in the event that some cuts do need to be required, we do need to materialize something, that we have a couple of plans. So, we could look at something, again, recognizing all the departments are important. We got to have Department of Public Works, we've got to have water, we've got to have fire protection, we've got to have police protection. But I guess I'd like to see what it would mean if we had kind of a 5% and a 10% cut in the departments, because I think a 10% cut's about 1.7 million or so, if I'm not mistaken. But if we could take a look at that in the next month, I'd like to make sure the board has an opportunity to weigh in on how those would look. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mansour. One of the things, Mr. Lehman, you might mention is where you're at with the departments and asking them for suggestions.
So everybody's aware of the size of the loss, and again, doesn't impact our business type activities. That's going to be completely different for like water and sewer, because that's going to be based on those sales. And I think I said that at the last meeting, we have seen a decrease in the commercial usage of about 25% in the 2-month period, which certainly causes some concern. This is more with general fund activities, and it's impossible to do, say, let's do a 10% cut across the board for every department. I mean, we can give that direction, but the reality of it is, like a department like finance might have 3 people working there, and the only raw materials we use are 3 people. I can't, unless we talk about furloughing some hours potentially, but I don't believe I can accomplish that when I only have 3 people working there. Although that is one of the things we're looking at in each department, is the potential to furlough employees for 1 day a week and have them work 4 days and then be off a day in order to save some money. Certainly that impacts them. They can qualify for that federal unemployment $600 insurance right now, but that will end at the end of July. And we have those plans in place and ready to move forward. Any other general expenditures we're cutting out. Again, like I said, we have fund balance. I'm not trying to mislead anybody. We're going to be able to deliver all the services that government's required to deliver, but it would mean a shift from fund balance from spending OPEB, which is what we've been doing quite successfully, and maybe using that to shore up operations moving forward. Wouldn't be putting that entire amount into paying down unfunded liabilities moving forward. But I'd be happy to share as we go through with the departments projected cuts, and we'll start work on the 2021 budget in the next month as well.
So, Mr. Lehman, next month you would be able to share with us some more information in terms of the areas that we're looking at where we could cut and save some money?
I mean, primarily it's in labor. I mean, our raw materials are people, and that's the biggest challenge we have. It's about cutting services. I mean, you can do easier things like the capital is one thing. We have $1.6 million in our capital project budget this year. We cannot do capital, but that isn't going to be used for operating funds. It's going to remain in capital, so it has less impact on what that means for us. It's more about our operations. We could, eliminate snow plowing, or we can look at certain services. Like I said, my biggest concern right now, budgetary-wise, is the heck of an impact we had on Parks and Recreation. I know how important it is to the board that we, take over operations, and we really do a nice job with that. Certainly, the director that you guys chose is all on board. He's the workhorse and he really wants to make that thing shine. But without that revenue coming in, it's, I've got some real serious concerns about if we're going to have to allocate a few $100,000 just into Parks and Recreation to get us through 2020 because of the loss of the programs and what kind of impact that has as well. So we've got a lot of balls up in the air right now that we're juggling, trying to come up with some answers. But until we know when we can flip that switch and get programming going again, and when we can all get back to some semblance of resuming where we were, there's more question marks than there are answers right now.
And then I know Mr. Massey's had his hand up. I'll get to you in just a moment, Mr. Massey. In terms of, I know Mr. Massey said we won't know until September. Is that, I might have missed it, but is that the time frame, Mr. Limita, that you feel that we'll know? I mean, when do we get the revenue sharing check in hand or know what that money is going to be?
Revenue sharing payments come in every 2 months. So obviously the impact of the loss of sales tax, which totally derives it, that impact is right now. I think what Trustee Massey was referring to is that we'll know by the federal legislation whether the stimulus package has filtered down through the state to local governments. And like I said, if that's the case, and it is an election year, so Washington wants to do the right thing for all of us out here in local government. So I hope that he's right. I hope there's optimism that it carries through and they allow them to backfill. Right now, the last stimulus package, the wording would not allow states to use that money to backfill to local government. So I hope they get it right next time and allow them, and what percentage of that we get recouped. I hope we're made whole, but I just don't know at this time.
We'll try and wrap this up, Mr. Massey, and then Mr. Mansour on Mr. Atkins.
I have a great concern. It bothers me from a financial and a leadership perspective that the superintendent can say that every time, basically, this is what the superintendent alluded to. This is what I got from what he said. Every time there are cuts, we talk about cuts, it seems like he throws out laying off people. I do believe that there are other cuts besides the laying off people. I do believe that from a financial perspective and from a leadership perspective in running the business. I do believe that. We always, not only in the township, most business, when it comes down to talk about cutting costs, first thing they look at is laying off employees. There are other costs that we have that may not be as necessary to move forward with some of the things that we have allocated funds for. So we should look at those items and cut those items before we lay off employees. That's my, from a leadership and a finance perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Mr. Limita, I believe that about 60% of our budget is salaries, or is it possibly even higher than that?
It's more than that, and I'd be happy to get that exact percentage for you. Our raw materials are people. That's what we have. We don't have a lot of raw materials that we don't buy. We deliver services. We take money in and we deliver services. We could eliminate snow plowing and save $80,000. I can try to buy cheaper paper and save $10,000, but if I'm trying to find $1.6 million, it's people. It's eliminating a service. We can look at the services that we provide, and then I won't be making that decision. The board will be making that decision on what's important to you or what you feel is important to the residents. But it's primarily people. And what we deliver is through people. And I think I showed you during the budget presentation last year that we're down 12 people from where we were in 2007. We still operate at less revenue than we had in 2007, 2008. We have 12 people less today. We try to do things much more, smarter with labor. I'm willing to look at anything. If you have some suggestions, Trustee Massey, or if you've seen something in the budget that you believe is much more important to be cut, please share that information and we'll pursue that. I mean, from a leadership perspective, we look at everything. Every one of my department heads is going through their budget trying to see what they can do without. But primarily, if you look at the departments, it's people. That's what we spend money on and their benefits. Most of those are also contractually obligated. We can't make changes unless those are negotiated changes.
And I have sat in on the meetings with the leadership of each of our departments, and I'd like to commend the leadership of Mr. Leamet, our superintendent, for directing all of our department heads to look for what those options are. And I do not believe that our department heads or our police chief or our fire chief, the first thing on their list is looking at how many people they can cut. They're looking at how they can best deliver service for the dollars that they receive, and where there can be cuts without dropping service or people. Mr. Mansour, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. So I know that we have been, blessed or fortunate to have able to set money aside to pay down OPEB quickly. But if we decide to balance, maybe we reduce or have to reduce some of that. And if we have all the departments taking cuts of one type or another, and that looks like it's going to be our reality, I for one would be, certainly willing to look at some kind of a sharing of that kind of pain in terms of compensation as a board member. So again, we need to pull all the levers we can. But if it turns out that a lot of people are going to be impacted, then I just want to share that I'd be certainly willing to look at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mansour. We'll get one more here, Mr. Thomas, and then I think we're ready to, I don't know, Mr. Atkins, did you have your hand up as well? Okay. Mr. Thomas and then Mr. Atkins. We'll go around here. Mr. Thomas?
I totally agree with Trustee Mansour. We're putting $1 million aside for the OPEB, and that's what it seems pretty close to what we're going to lose. So I would like Superintendent Lehman to give us a list, and let's look at the budget without the OPEB $1 million contribution to it. And I just want to see what that looks like. Secondly, I'm totally with Trustee Mansour. I will give up my compensation for the rest of the year. I do not want to see anybody lose their job. So I'm with Trustee Mansour. I give up my compensation, but I want to see what the OPEB looks like with the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Atkins?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, this is the third meeting that we've talked about this subject of declining revenue and cost sharing. Our residents have enough to worry about every day looking at the news. I think now, instead of, continuing to talk about it, I know Mr. Lehman is looking at some data, but I think now we need to start looking at things versus just hearing cut, and we're losing money.
So what things would you like to look at, Mr. Atkins?
Whatever Mr. Lehman, we've talked about this before at budget time. Give the board a couple of recommendations on what he would think from an operational perspective, and give the board something to digest here. Just throwing out there needs to be some cuts and we're going to lose $1 million or something. That just sows more fear into our residents, and I really don't have anything to throw a dart at and say, hey, that's a good idea or that's a bad idea.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a moving target. We don't know exactly what that revenue sharing is going to be. We don't know if the state will somehow shore things up or the feds will. We just know that we need to be prepared. And I think, Mr. Lehman has asked the department heads to look at what areas they can reduce and still provide optimum service. I think we said that next month we will plan on getting those reports from those department heads and look at what those are. But I think the board, it's prudent for the board to look at the budget and also see, we're going to be the ones deciding and asking Mr. Lima to we're going to be making the decision. So we need to take a look at the budget ourselves and see if there's areas where we think that we can cut. And I would encourage you to email or communicate with Mr. Lima with regard to those suggestions or questions when you're looking at the budget. If you see something that maybe you think is a want instead of a need, email Mr. Lima and ask him, hey, is this something that we can reduce? But otherwise, I think the department heads are working on what those choices might be, and I think Mr. Lima has said that he'll bring us a report next month. So hopefully Mr. Massey is correct. I wish I had a crystal ball that could tell us whether or not the feds are going to come in to help the local municipalities, but there are, there's a lot of doomsday talk out there, and it's making all of us nervous. But as a board, our job is to look out for the future of the township, and unfortunately, we've got to look at, a few months ago we were looking at a very bright future with Tech Village, what have you. Now we need to consider another chain of events that's occurred and how we may deal with that if we don't receive any additional funds. Mr. Massey, and then I think we're going to wrap this up. I think everybody's had an opportunity to weigh in.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
As a suggestion.
Yes.
Instead of someone emailing something in and it doesn't get recognized and and get the recognition as it should, why not have a workshop? We have a workshop that we can meet when things open back up, and we can take a deep dive into the budget that way.
We can do that too, but in the meantime, I know that some board members like to get moving on it sooner. So if somebody, and I don't know of anybody's email that isn't recognized, but if somebody emails Mr. Limata and myself, we will respond to it and look at it. With that, I think, anybody else have any input on this issue?
No.
Mr. Mansour?
No, I was just going to make a motion to adjourn.
Okay. Is there support for Mr. Mansour's motion? Support by Mr. Massey. Ms. Lane?
I was also going to support it, but that's fine if Mr. Massey wants to do it.
We'll go ahead and call the vote, Ms. Lane.
All right, Mr. Mansour?
Yes.
Massey?
Yes.
Mr. Adkins?
Yes.
Mr. Thomas?
Yes.
Mr. Gozak?
Yes.
Myself, yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.